Welcome to the By Design radio program. My name is Dr. James Proodian of Proodian Healthcare and ProodianHealthcare.com, where health literacy is the key to longevity. And as long as God has us on this side of eternity, my show is designed to help educate you and your families to feel better, function better, and live as many quality disease-free years as possible. Thanks for joining me this week as we're coming off a couple of weeks on grain, whole grains, and then we did gluten last week. Got some good feedback from you guys. I also blogged this week on a subject matter we spoke about numerous times on the show on hormonal health and living in the state of fight or flight. That's at drproodian.com. Each week on Wednesdays I blog, and my radio show is on Saturdays. So those are the two informational pieces I push out each week. I got more emails and people stopping by the office about the blog this week. I was a little surprised about that because normally gluten kind of lights up everybody. So if you didn't catch last week's show on gluten, you could go to the YouTube channel and check that out, because that's going to sort of tell directly into what we're going to be talking about today and a lot of my future shows, is looking at some of these insensitivities. Like we talked about last week, how gluten could be an allergy, but most of the time it's an intolerance, and the intolerances are the things that we have to look for, because allergies are pretty easy to spot. You know, we have these severe allergic reactions like rashes, hives, even anaphylactic, whereas an intolerance or a hypersensitivity could present itself days after we eat the food that we have the intolerance to. So catch that show last week, because this week we're going to be talking about more about food labeling. We got into that a bit last week, but we're going to go over that a little bit more in depth today. And I'm going to start introducing you to a new book called The Disease Delusion, which was written by Dr. Jeff Bland, B-L-A-N-D. Dr. Bland is when I say a teacher of mine, he's basically somebody that I've followed my entire career. And the Disease Delusion is his latest book. Jeff Bland, I highly recommend you guys pick it up. He's the quintessential nutritionist of our time, basically the Linus Pauling, if you will, of today. Absolutely brilliant, and a great teacher, and someone that I'm going to be taking parts of his book apart for you guys. So before we get going, Luke 1:37, for with God nothing is impossible. And as we reshape our lives and living a godly life, instead of following man's plan, we want to follow God's plan. Let me introduce you to a word that I have used since the late 90s. I became a Christian in 97, right before I got married. My wife and I accepted Christ on the same day in November, 4 months before we got married. So it was a blessing. And as I'm sure many of you guys remember, the greatest day of your life. And since that time, I've been doing a lot of studying on what's called the counterculture. And it's interesting because I find a direct correlation between my By Design ministry and being a Christian in the counterculture, which basically means that as we go to church and as we listen to pastors, as Christians, we realize that we're living in a culture today that we really don't participate directly in, meaning that there are so many things in today's culture that we live in what's called a counterculture. So even though something like something as simple or as not so simple as alcohol and how accepted alcohol is in our society, or bad language, or divorce, things like that, are social issues of the time. As they become more and more accepted, we hear how pastors talk about them, and we all realize that we should be living in a counterculture because we're following God's plan. Well, the By Design ministry, because I'm not a pastor, I basically was looking for and praying for a direction in my career where that I didn't just treat patients and I was teaching, but I wanted something that I could expand my horizons and teach Christians. And everything that I do is sort of like a counterculture, meaning that if you open up your health journals and you read about stress, nutrition, and the exercise, it's not necessarily what society is telling you to do. And that's because man has influenced society so greatly that our health is so damaged. So keep that in mind as we do this show and other shows, that we're kind of living in a counterculture from a nutritional and a physical perspective. as I teach my shows, meaning that every time I design one of my shows, I realize that it may not be information that you know about. You may have never heard it before, and you might be like, well, how come my doctor didn't tell me that? Because the culture of today really hasn't really caught up on a lot of what I've been teaching you, even though it is directly related to science. Everything that I teach comes right out of textbooks, right out of the most relevant science journals. So let's start with taking that kind of philosophy or that kind of understanding of counterculture into today's program, where we're looking at food labeling. And, the average consumer reading food packaging can be overwhelming. You get natural, organic, non-GMO, gluten-free, free range, etc. You get the picture. There's a lot of programming that goes on with food labeling, and it could be overwhelming. And I don't expect many of you guys to understand this, but let's go through a couple of them. Let's first start with the word organic. And it is, in my opinion, very important to seek organic food, especially certain types of food. Now, organic food is free of antibiotics, hormones, genetic engineering, genetic modification, radiation, synthetic pesticides, and synthetic fertilizers. So many of the food additives and practices that these things that I just routed off, they've demonstrated to be harmful. Okay, so, the fact that hormones and antibiotics and genetic engineering is part of man's food supply, living in the counterculture, I like to think of myself as living 200-300 years ago when there was no such thing as non-organic food. Food was organic. That's the way food was designed. It was designed to be grown in good soil, picked and eaten, or, harvested. So when we look at what the non-organic foods, or what organic is today, you go to the store and you're looking and you see this word organic, and that's what I just rattled off are the things that are not part of organic food. So when we look at the USDA, about 10 years, in about 2000, they came out with the rules surrounding the term organic. And when you'll see various versions of the word organic on the label. Now, the first and the best should be 100% organic. Yes, it matters if the 100% appears before the word organic, because when it says 100% organic, this means you could expect the product to contain only organic ingredients. Now, if it just says organic, that means the food manufacturers are required to have 95% of the product's ingredients to be organic. The remaining 5% can be non-organic. Okay, so I think that it's important that you know that, okay? And the fact that there's a difference between 100% organic and organic. Now, you could also say something that says made with organic ingredients. This basically means that 70% of the ingredients need to be organic. All right? So as you go shopping, those are the three labels: 100% organic, organic, or made with organic ingredients. And now you know what man has basically developed as labeling, and you could make your decisions as an informed consumer. Okay, again, we're living through our health journal here, and our health journal, we're jotting these things down so we realize what they mean. Now, the next part of food labeling is you probably see all natural or the word natural. Now, these two words have very little meaning to me personally, because the USDA, in terms of labeling natural, it basically means it doesn't contain any artificial ingredients or preservatives. But what's very important is you could have the word natural in your ingredients list, and the food can contain antibiotics, growth hormones, and other additives. So be careful about the word all natural, or I should say natural. Now, all natural is a completely unregulated term, so it's basically the same as natural. My opinion is, if it says it on the label, it really doesn't mean a whole lot to me. The next is free range and cage-free. Now, free-range and cage-free is a couple of other terms that don't have a whole lot of meaning to me because these aren't regulated very well. It basically means a chicken could go outside and roam around for a little bit. They give it some outside accessibility. But outside of that, it really doesn't have a whole lot of credibility. So free range and cage free is very different than 100% organic. All right. And I think a lot of people out there might find that revealing. You may not know that. And that's why I'm doing this. Okay. So that's an important one. Last week we talked about, or 2 weeks ago, we talked about whole grain, right? Using the word whole before the word wheat or grain is the most important word that you could see if you eat wheat. Okay, so you want the word whole. Remember that in labeling. And also remember gluten-free. If you're going to eat gluten-free, it is important that foods are labeled gluten-free if you're trying to eat a gluten-free diet, especially if gluten is in wheat, barley, and rye. Do not confuse wheat-free with gluten-free. Just because something is wheat-free doesn't mean it doesn't contain gluten. Okay, so as you're doing your reading of your labels now, and you'll learn that today, and I think that's a good lesson with respect to looking at labels, knowing the difference between whole wheat or enriched wheat, or, for instance, organic versus 100% organic. These are the little kind of nuances that the FDA throws at us, which drive us crazy. I wish food labeling was simpler, but hopefully you found my explanation somewhat simple. So let's continue the conversation on what's called the counterculture, which is when we wake up every day and we realize that we're not going to participate in many of the culturally accepted things of this world. I want to read you some of the foreword from Dr. Bland's book, and the foreword was written by Dr. Mark Hyman, Hyman. He's an MD up in Massachusetts. He wrote a great book called The Blood Sugar Solution, which I highly recommend. And he wrote a great foreword to this book. I want to read you some of it, and I think it could capture where we're at as a nation and why we should be living in a wellness lifestyle, following God's plan in the counterculture understanding. If we're living counterculturally as Christians, I leave that up to my pastors to teach me that part of my life, and I love listening to them to be in that counterculture. From a wellness perspective, let's just state some of what's going on today. The state of medicine today, we're facing a tsunami of chronic disease that will cost our global economy $47 trillion over the next 20 years and kill twice as many people around the world as infectious disease. Now, infectious disease, guys, if you go back 150 years ago, you realize that women were predominantly dying from something as simple as we consider it today as childbirth fever or a bad chest infection or strep throat. Infections were the leading causes of death. So we created antibiotics and we've created the way to treat these acute illnesses. But what we're left with today is man has created so much chronic illness. We're talking about $47 trillion over the next 20 years. And we spend more for healthcare and we get less and less. The United States has the worst healthcare outcomes and lower life expectancy than almost every other developed nation. You may not know that. Okay, we are tremendously great, number one, for acute illness. But for chronic illness, we're not doing a very good job, and it's costing a lot of money. The conditions like heart disease, diabetes, cancer, autoimmune diseases, digestive disorders, dementia, allergies, asthma, arthritis, depression, attention deficit disorder, Parkinson's, hormonal problems. These are the types of conditions that are draining our financial resources, and chronic disease now affects 1 in 2 Americans, and it accounts for 80% of our healthcare costs. So let me repeat that. If we know, and we know that our healthcare costs are going up $47 trillion, 80% of that number 80% of that number is chronic disease. Most of chronic disease is man-made. That means we're doing this to ourselves. 1 in 2 people in America have a chronic illness. And despite the host of new drugs and procedures, the incidence of chronic disease continues to rise not only in the United States, but globally, especially in developed countries that are adopting our food and our culture. Once again, counterculture to food and counterculture to the American lifestyle many times is a positive thing. So the answer to this means that we need to start working outside of what we're seeing around us, because our current medical system is constructed to treat acute illness, and we are tremendous at treating acute illness. But when you look at it from a statistical perspective, we realize that the epidemic of chronic illness forces us to live in a counterculture. So this article I read on counterculture back in the late 90s in the New Yorker, or it might have been the New York Times, was a tremendous article on Christians living in a counterculture, moving out of cities and populated areas and living in more rural areas because they wanted to raise their family outside of this culture. Let's think about our lives from a nutritional perspective, a psychological perspective, a physical perspective, doing the same thing. And hopefully that's relevant to you as we're all trying to do better things to live a wellness lifestyle. Thank you for listening to me, Dr. James Proodian, this week in the By Design radio program. If you want any more information about me, please go to ProodianHealthcare.com and submit any questions. Have a blessed week and be well.